Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. My guest this month is Dell J. Rose. Dell is a cultural historian and current Ph.D. researcher at the University of Amsterdam's HHP Center. He is also the recipient of the Swedenborg Doctoral Scholarship from the Swedenborg Society in the UK. Dell holds a bachelor's degree with majors in English history and religion and a master's degree in folk studies. His current PhD project deals with Charles Augustus Tulk, the reception of Swedenborg's ideas amongst 19th century reforming societies, and the role that Swedenborgian ideas played in 19th century political discourse. Dell has many academic interests which examine the interface between culture and esotericism, including Christian theosophy, as well as the relationship between romantic nationalism and esotericism. He also works on the relationship between technology and esotericism, especially in the history of aviation and the airship. Today's topic centers around Emanuel Swedenborg, who was and still is an extremely influential figure within the currents of esotericism. Dell begins by giving a short introduction about Swedenborg and then moves to discuss other aspects of Swedenborg's life and beliefs that led to his eventual quote-unquote revelations about the nature of the spiritual world and free will. Dell is particularly concerned with the cultural reception of Swedenborg, and he notes that Swedenborg's influence is varied but overwhelming. This influence is seen in all forms of cultural life from the 19th century onwards, in areas such as art, literature, and music, but also in the political sphere, including public planning, cooperative societies, and women's rights. Dell shares his own research into Charles Augustus Tulk, who was keen to implement Swedenborg's ideas onto social issues, as well as other figures who were also inspired by Swedenborgian thought. I hope you'll enjoy the discussion. Welcome to the podcast, Dell.
Well, thank you so very much.
It is a pleasure to be able to talk with you about Emanuel Swedenborg, or Swedenborg. We'll probably be saying it both ways, at least I probably will. I've talked about, I've mentioned Swedenborg several times in previous podcast episodes, but only in passing. So I'm very happy to be able to delve more deeply into his ideas and teachings today.
Oh, well, there's certainly a lot to delve into.
Indeed. So let's get started. My first question for you is regarding Swedenborg or Swedenborg himself. For those who may not be familiar with Emanuel Swedenborg, could we start with a brief introduction about him and his life before he made his quote-unquote shift to focus on spiritual matters?
Yeah. So Emanuel Swedenborg is born in 1688. He's the son of a bishop in the Lutheran Church, Jesper Swedenborg. This was before Jesper receives a nobility title, and that shifted from Swedenborg to Swedenborg. And I always just sort of say Swedenborg myself. So, I mean, I mispronounce. I butcher the name all the time. Yeah, he was born in 1688. His father was very influenced by Lutheran pietism, and he was brought up in, it was the most intellectually progressive area in Sweden, and in his very family unit. His father was also a professor of theology, and throughout his early years, he was constantly introduced to theologians, philosophers, mathematicians. He moved in with his brother-in-law, Benselius, and Benselius was a leading Orientalist, a Swedish Orientalist, He was very instrumental in working and building networks and connections with Jewish groups in the continent. He was very influential in actually bringing Jewish settlers. One of the most famous was Johannes Kemper, who was a convert to Christianity and had been formerly involved in the Sabbatean movement before that. And it's not entirely clear. I personally want to believe this, that Kemper was his Hebrew teacher, but I can't say that for sure. Okay. It's a little bit of contention. Martha Keith Schuchard, for instance, she holds that belief. But so it was a very intellectual childhood, and in some ways, his father was very nurturing to a lot of these spiritual aspirations that Swedenborg, from a very early age, showed a predilection for spirituality and for understanding the Bible and for the natural world. And, we often speak in terms of the shift, that there was a period in Swedenborg's life where he started off being very sort of secular, and then he became religious. But in truth, there is a continuing line of investigation that follows him from his very earliest days. I can't remember who said it, but there's this phrase, haunted by God. And in a very real sense, Swedenborg was always, his passion for the natural world, his passion for the spiritual world were always part of the same passion and the same drive. How do I understand? And that really continues throughout his life.
Well, thank you for pointing that out. I think that given his work, his profession, that probably many people, myself included, thought that maybe he wasn't really focusing that much on spiritual matters while he was, involved with all of his work and duties. But thank you for making that distinction. That's an important one to remember as we continue our discussion, at least for me, and maybe for the listeners as well. Now, this is not meant as any form of ridicule or disrespect, but in many of the texts that we read, at a certain point, the discussion comes up about Swedenborg's life, that he experienced a type of crisis. And in many of the writings, it's quoted as being a type of religious crisis or a spiritual crisis, and that he kept a diary of this period of time in his life where a lot of things were happening to him. And I was wondering if you could expand on this, and after this period of time where there were all these things changing in his life, could you talk also about what those change, what this period of, I guess, transitioning or change, however you want to fill that in, what this actually led to for Swedenborg eventually?
Yeah. So when we start in his earliest period, so when he starts writing after he moves in with Benzelius the Younger, Swedenborg, during about, it starts in the 1730s, and it really, I think, continues, well into the 1740s, where he's completely and totally devoted toward understanding various aspects of the natural world. So he's very interested in anatomy and physiology. He's interested in expanding understandings of mechanics and flight, for instance. He's fascinated by all of these things. And he basically spends this early period, working with all of this devotion, trying to understand mathematics and this is a long way of answering your question. I know.
No, please take your time.
Yeah, he starts off with trying to create what you call a complete sort of vision of the natural world. Now, this starts to really have, it starts to really rub him in the wrong way, where it becomes, I think, in the middle 1740s, so like 1744, etc., and a little bit actually previous to this, he starts having doubts about, the world that he's investigating, and whether or not it's going to be possible to create this huge totalizing, that was the word I was looking for, totalizing vision of the world. So he starts having this issue, and this idea that maybe there's not going to be the sorts of answers he's looking for. This is sort of how I read this encounter. And after this, this sort of takes him for a very negative turn, and he gets very sad about this. And, he begins, for instance, he starts writing about his dreams, and he starts doing a lot of soul searching. And, he starts trying to, I think, make sense about the sort of world that he's looked at, and tries to, he's searching from that moment for a spiritual answer. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then that's sort of the world that precipitates his when he starts receiving revelation. And there's several, when we talk specifically about, what was it that he was sort of doing, his entire scientific and particularly his anatomical work and his work in biology is trying to answer that question at the very core of reality. What is it that connects the spiritual and the material? This is what he starts. He writes this. It sort of has this bizarre title in English, but it's The Economy of the Animal Kingdom, or the Soul's Economy. I can't remember the exact quote from the title, but it's this idea that he's trying in that moment to understand, how there is a divine life, a divine force that's flowing through the physical world. And he sort of ends the economy of the soul's kingdom. That's what it's called, I think. He sort of ends that moment on this sort of low note. And I really think that did sort of send him into a very profound spiritual sadness. And this is the crisis that people are often referring to. And that will, of course, this is right before he starts receiving spiritual revelation. And he sort of makes this formal jump. See, that's another way you can sort of look at it. All of Swedenborg's writings previously are asking this question: how does the material world and the spiritual world come together? After he starts receiving his revelations, in 1744, in the fall of 1744, that's when he starts receiving answers in a much more direct way. It's fascinating time.
Indeed. So these ideas that are now starting to arise within him, that are coming forth out of, or as a result of the revelations that he was receiving and experiencing, these ideas about how the material and spiritual worlds operate, how they're connected. These ideas differ in many ways from traditional Christian beliefs, and in this case, the Lutheran, I guess, ideas about Christianity. For example, he believed that, Swedenborg believed that angels and demons, as we understand them, are actually human beings that lived a material, physical life first. And I found this to be very interesting. Could you talk more about this? And actually a little bit, I guess, add on to that, how Swedenborg is understanding what the spirit world is all about.
Well, this is, I think, what makes Swedenborg so interesting, because, he was brought up as a natural scientist. He had this great attention to detail, to nuance, to particularity, almost like a geologist. He's fascinated by layers of meaning. And just in the same way that there's layers of complexity upon the earth, he felt the same about the spiritual world. And the idea that he becomes most famous for is this is I guess what the spiritual world, that's his answering the question what the spiritual world is like. And then we'll move backwards to what it is to be an angel, which is, I think, one of Swedenborg's most interesting ideas. That everything that exists in our world, down to incredible details, corresponds, has a direct analogical relation to what is revealed in the spiritual world. Now, the most common sort of image that we have of this is the sun. This is the like all life in the material world receives benefits, nutrients, etc., from the presence of the sun. Swedenborg felt that the Lord, which in his references to Jesus, the Son, the Lord for Swedenborg rejected the traditional idea of Trinitarian Christianity, that God is three unique personalities, distinct personalities. He believed rather that Jesus was the embodiment of all three aspects of the Godhead. You had the Father, who was, the sort of soul, the Son, who is the body, and then the Holy Spirit for Swedenborg was the lasting presence or influence of the Lord. But Swedenborg said that when you look at the sun, and when you think about its place in the biological world, you see all these connections, how everything is dependent upon it. In the same way, in the spiritual world, there is a sun as well, and that is God, that is the Lord. And all life depends upon his presence and his influence, this divine influence that flows throughout all levels of existence. And without it, it does not exist. Now, Swedenborg translates this into an idea about where you find your place in the afterlife is based upon the quality and purity of your love. What you love defines who you are, Swedenborg says. And thus people who love joy and goodness and righteousness and who love the Lord find themselves in the next world, being drawn into angelic communities, living an angelic life, participating in the love and worship of God. And that we call those people angels. And they're also interacting with us. He makes that point, that these sort of clear demarcations between the natural world and the spiritual world, I mean, they exist. There is a spiritual world and there is a natural world, but they're much more closer than people would commonly believe. And so angels are the people who are drawn to that. They love the same things that heaven is drawn to, is like. And in the opposite of that, people who love wickedness, those people would become what we would call hells, or the demons. Swedenborg refers to the hells, the influence of the hells. But these are sort of demonic realms for people, basically loved themselves above anything else. They love their own will and their own desires, and that sort of puts them, because you can't basically, there's a hierarchy of loves, and those people are going to be drawn into these negative spiritual realms. And that's a very unique idea, because unlike in various forms of Christianity, Calvinism's one specifically, where they say, God has predestined someone to heaven or hell. Swedenborg says that's not it at all. That there is no predestining. There is no divine sentence that's passed on a soul. You go to that which makes you feel the most alive. And C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Great Divorce, has a sort of fascinating idea where he shows the premise of this fictional work is that people get to go to heaven once a year. And, for C.S. Lewis, and I think also for Swedenborg, to live in heaven, to to find yourself in heaven, to go to heaven, is to ultimately love things that are heavenly. And that's such an interesting idea, because he puts a lot of emphasis not solely upon doing something, although Swedenborg is very big on you have to do it, but it sort of has to permeate the entirety of one's being. So there's no shortcuts with the way Swedenborg presents these things. And it's a very interesting notion.
So you mentioned correspondences. So in this example, would then, I guess this kind of ties into my next question about the idea that people create their own heaven and hell. So on the material, physical world or plane, we're living our lives, we're doing things either for in love or in the opposite of that to whatever degree. When I'm trying to understand then when we transition from the physical to the spiritual world, is it all basically the same thing that we're doing here, or like we have a quote unquote life that we lead, that we're doing basically the same types of things? Do we have places where we dwell? Do we still sleep? Are we awake? Are we sleeping? Or do we work? What? Because I've heard the statement made that, and I don't know if it's accurate, but Swedenborg thought that the spiritual world was actually the real world, and the material world was kind of like this illusion. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that. I don't know if that makes any sense. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think you're making sense.
Okay.
Granted, I mean, I can't promise that I'll make any sense, but yeah, let's go.
Okay.
So, yes, I mean, I would be hesitant to say, Swedenborg believed that the quote-unquote real world is illusory, because I don't believe that's what he said.
Okay.
I would say that he would say that the physical world is incomplete without the spiritual world. And the meaning of the spiritual world is incredibly important. Now, when we want to talk about, what does life look like in heaven, I think that many of us who, if you've ever grown up around, Protestant or traditional Christian views about what the afterlife is like, it's sort of like, I can't remember. There was this magazine I saw where someone was in heaven and they're floating around on a cloud and they're looking down and they go, I wish I would have brought a magazine, because it's sort of boring, just float around. But for Swedenborg, the spiritual world was profoundly alive.
Uh-huh.
And that how you found yourself in different heavenly society was based on that which you loved to do. And this is his response to a kingdom of uses. That there is this, that you are unified by what you truly can contribute. And that you are drawn to people who have similar goals. If you, for instance, are someone who has a very large humanity or compassionate self, and you want to do well for others, this is something that would draw you into certain heavenly communities of angels, because you're unified by that love to serve and to do well. And for Swedenborg, any religious belief, any spiritual practice itself, is always dependent upon what it does in a practical sense. Swedenborg often rejected this idea, which is very prominent in Lutheranism, this idea of salvation by faith alone. Mm-hmm. Because this sort of constant repetition, by faith alone, without works, is a very common Protestant way of referring to this. But to Swedenborg, actual devotion to God requires, a manifestation in practicality. And that everybody should seek to serve, to be of use. This is the language in English. To be of use to God's kingdom. And that it's not enough simply to believe. or it's not enough to simply go through religious outfits. That has to have a actual, tangible, representation or outgrowth. And it's very, I don't know, it's very challenging, sort of the way that he depicts spirituality, because it's not solely an intellectual assent. I believe something. It's more, I believe, and thus my life is transformed. Thus my actions are transformed. And it's also a sort of gradual process, because in Swedenborg's depictions about what happens to people after they die, and he goes, this is his most important work. It's called Heaven and Hell. I shouldn't say important, because I don't mean to say it's the most important of all of his writings, but it's certainly the most popular.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the one. If anybody's read anything from Swedenborg, it's probably this one.
Probably that one, yeah.
And it's sort of this. It's based on his experiences in the next realm. So he goes into the spiritual realm and he observes and he writes down what he's experienced. But he talks about upon the initial death, someone is awoken in the spiritual realm. And then over a period of trying, they find out what their true motivations are in life, what their true loves were. And that will determine their ultimate destiny. Because when people sort of go into the spiritual world, they're drawn. And in this sense, it provides a great deal more, I think, is a very fascinating idea about human agency, because he sort of has this idea that a soul is a composite of all action, which I find to be really, really, really fascinating. Then that's unified with a particular love, and that draws them in a particular way. And it is fascinating. I can't think of many other writers who have, no other writer had the exact same idea. But this idea that you are essentially what you love. This is your spiritual nature. I mean, that's I always thought that was so interesting that I would go through.
I realize I forgot to come back to the correspondences comment that you made. You mentioned about the sun, but in regard to how we can see correspondences from the material or physical and in the spiritual world. So could we say the correspondence is how, say, one person lives their life on the physical, in the physical world, doing, their work to help others, they care for others, they, whatever it is that they're doing with their work in whatever capacity, but that there is this definite idea of compassion, giving to others, helping others, then that would correspond to their spiritual life in heaven. And naturally, if someone in this world is only concerned with selfish desires and not really caring about what happens to anyone else and is only thinking about themselves, and if that means other people are harmed in the process, then that would then correspond to how their life will be in the spiritual world. Am I understanding this correctly?
That's how I understand it.
Okay.
Yeah. because he talks about, in his travels through the spiritual realm, he talks about you can identify the sort of dominant sins or main sins of the various communities in hell, based on what that's been transmuted into the spiritual world. And that's also a very interesting idea, because unlike in traditional doctrines of hell as a place of punishment, in Swedenborg's sort of view, and it's very subtle, one is punished in hell because it's something you can't escape. It's the visions that you've created for yourself. And more than that, you don't want to go to heaven. Heaven is terrifying and awkward and painful for you. So hell is this place where you can exist to sort of extend your own wishes and your own desires. And because those desires are corrupt, it also, therefore, is corrupt. It appears corrupted and mirely.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's not all clear that the people who are actually going through those sort of states see it in the same way. So Swedenborg has conversations with souls that are quote unquote suffering, and in hell there's very often there's almost they're not exactly alert to the fact that they're in a terrible place, and that I think shows a lot of the sort of psychological realism of Swedenborg. Is that for him, the real state of hellishness is to be so sort of disconnected from, from reality, from the way things are, and to sort of be lost in your own selfish creation of the world. It's very subtle, and that movie, Robin Williams was in it.
What Dreams May Come.
What dreams may come.
Yeah.
His wife commits suicide, and she finds herself in hell because she's lost her true motivation. She's living in this sort of hellish mentality, and that has produced this spiritual result. And that's a very sort of telling vision that Swedenborg had. And I think it's gradually entered into popular culture much more successfully, but it was a particularly radical idea when he was writing in the late 18th century.
Well, it's quite different in the sense that human beings here, in the way that they live their life, are creating their own heaven or own hell. It's not as you said, there's no punishment or reward coming from an outside authoritarian figure that's, meting out your just desserts or whatever it is, but you're doing this to yourself. And that there might be people who don't really want to live in joy or love or beauty, that they just want to reject that altogether.
Yeah. And in that sense, that particular way, I would say you're correct. I would say that you could read that into Swedenborg. Although, like everything else, I mean, when you get down to brass tacks, there's slight differences. But yeah, that is the general idea, is that, if you live a heavenly life here, you will find yourself living a heavenly life in the next spiritual world. And if you find yourself in a sort of wicked state where you desire nothing more than to serve yourself, Swedenborg says that the Lord has provided you a space for that in the next world, and that is hell. And there's this beautiful story about Swedenborg when he's talking to a little girl, and he says, she asks him, she says, well, what does heaven look like? And he takes her, and he takes a mirror, and he says, what does an angel look like? That's what she asked. And he takes a mirror, and he lets her see her reflection in it. Because there's this idea that this is angels and demons, heaven and hell. These are not so far off from the mental and spiritual states we cultivate on this plane. And also, and this does have to be said, Swedenborg was a Lutheran. He spent most of his life deeply involved in spiritual study. And not only, so we've talked a lot about how he views the world in general, but he also brings this particular type of correspondential teaching to how he reads the Bible. Because for Swedenborg, the Bible is not solely a depiction of what happened in the past, not solely telling stories. It's telling an entire spiritual revelation. And he saw his work, and really his entire goal, the goal of the New Jerusalem, his writing, as the expounding of the spiritual teachings within the Bible. What is spiritual, and very often these are very complicated ideas. So he takes particular spiritual images, scriptural images, and he shows their teachings, their correspondence, what they're designed to signify in the next world. And it's a very symbolic or allegorical interpretation of most elements of the Bible. And he writes, this is his arguably, again, one of his most significant works, which is called Secrets of Heaven, Arcana Celestia, where he goes through in excruciating detail, showing the spiritual significance of hundreds of different words or terms used in the Bible. Create this image that's not only, it involves human psychology, the natural world, scriptural exegesis, and it sort of throws it all together. And it creates this very totalizing vision. Yeah, so from the scripture you can extrapolate, layers and layers of spiritual meaning. And that these correspond to different ages in humanity's development, the different development of the soul. And it really is a way, it's sort of amplifying the scriptural message across all elements of existence, both in the physical world, in human history, in strong examinations of the world. He sort of layers all these things together and doesn't allow you to move from it. And it's a fascinating analogical exercise. And it's sort of keeping in mind all of these different layers of existence all at the same time. And it just is unbelievably fascinating for a variety of reasons, especially for the political reception, which we're going to talk about later, which is what people also tried to say, if there is a connection between the spiritual world and the natural world, and Swedenborg has gone into the spiritual realms, he's journeyed in the spiritual realms, he's seen things in the spiritual realm, we have a blueprint to bring some of those insights and to apply them into our world, to create a heaven on this earth. And it was a very influential notion.
Right. Well, you were saying that there were these very complex notions and ideas that were intertwined in the stories of the Bible, and how this was kind of mapping out or showing, in Swedenborg's opinion, that there were these stages of development for human beings. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
That's one of the applications. Is, like for instance with the days of creation, for instance, this is also a metaphor, a correspondence about the soul's development, and it's also a metaphor about the stages of the church. So it's very, very much like that.
Okay. On a little bit of a different topic, I guess maybe not. Maybe there could be a connection, but with regard to the idea of free will, there is a contemporary podcaster, a philosopher, atheist, Sam Harris, who's had some very interesting conversations about free will and how he feels, or he is convinced, I should say, that there is no free will, that it's all just random things that happen, or in combination with how you were, and into what situation you were born, your life, how you were raised, your economic situation, et cetera, and that things that happen to people are mainly based upon that, or just dumb luck or dumb bad luck. However, there's this other idea that God gave us this notion of free will, and that we have a choice in the matter. We can choose the good path, or we can choose the wrong path, in so many words. And also this idea about, that there's a certain type of fate involved, because if we're reading the Bible, for example, there seems to kind of be this idea that, there are things that are going to happen in the future that, God has already made known to us. That we just don't know when it's going to actually happen. So in looking at these two, I guess, sides of the spectrum, where would Swedenborg land in this spectrum?
Well, so this is a really, really interesting point. So, granted, we can talk about Harris's scientific determinism, that you are inherently determined by your environment, by your physical standing. You're determined by all these external forces. And Swedenborg definitely is not going to say that there is no influence. Like, Swedenborg often talks about you are surrounded by influences to heaven or hell. And, the choice to follow is a very subtle one. It's almost like the little tiny switch on a train track that you just go. And just for a half second, you may have incredible spiritual forces weighing on you from either side, and you may not feel as though you have any degree of self-determination. But it's that little tiny trick. It's like, okay, well, I've decided this and not that. That all of the influence comes down upon. So there are some people, Willem Blake, for instance, rejects Swedenborg's ideas because he says, well, he's a predestinarian, because he talks about there being influences upon the soul. But I really think that that's because, well, one, Blake probably didn't have access to the entirety of what Swedenborg had actually written. It's unclear how much Latin he was able to read, and it's unclear also about how much of the textual, of the entire Swedenborgian corpus he would have had access to. But it is sort of a subtle, everything in Swedenborg is about subtlety. And there is a sort of subtle suggestion that there is at the heart of reality a choice that is capable of being made. And actually, this is also related to how he views the sacrifice and redemption of Jesus is not in the same way of saving people, but rather to give people the opportunity to continue making choices, and to making choices for the divine will. And that's a very powerful point. Again, which is sort of underemphasized and is a very unique reading of the Christian experience. But as I've said, I've read Swedenborg a great deal, but I'm more familiar, if I'm honest, with the cultural reception of it. How people read him and extrapolate from him, versus so. Like how Blake understands or misunderstands, whatever the case may be, Swedenborg. But there is a very subtle notion of the self in Swedenborg, and it's also connected to something called proprium. It's an almost untranslatable term that he uses from Neo-Latin, which has connotations of both self-understanding, self-direction, but yeah, a very subtle view of what's humanly possible. And I think that going back to his amplification of the everyday, if you're trying to say that there is incredible spiritual significance in almost every event you have, very telling.
And
very telling.
And this term that you used, was it proprium? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
And that's the idea that there is this more subtle type of self? Am I not grasping what you're trying to say?
It's not white. It is sort of like that and sort of not like that. Oh, how would you even describe it? It's the idea, so proprium is the idea of self-ownership. The sense that you are your own person with your own. This is coming from their foundation, Dr. Jonathan Rose, I'm no relation, by the way. In Swedenborgian circles, people always say, "Are you related to Jonathan Rose?" And I say, no. I did know their father, Don Rose, and I corresponded with Don Rose for about 5 years, but till he passed away. And this idea that one has complete ownership of oneself, Swedenborg talks about as being somewhat illusory, because you have all these differing influences that are taking.
Okay.
So it's not. His notion of free will is not so direct that there's no other influences, but it's always that these influences are measured, and then at the core of it, what makes a spiritual destiny is your decision.
Okay.
Even against these incredible spiritual odds, one way or the other.
Now, this statement that you just made, that makes me think there are a lot of people that think that way. I hear a lot of people talking about that. Despite everything that's happening in your life that could just be really, sending all of these signals or maybe triggering you to want to make the wrong choice, you still do the right thing. Then that's this perseverance and whatever this mindset that you have, or this drive or this passion that you have, that you're, that this is the best choice for you and you're going to do it regardless of all of the turmoil and the tribulation. So, and you also mentioned that you are interested in the cultural reception of these ideas. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. How do we see these notions, these ideas playing out now?
Yes. That is my bread and butter, is how the ideas are translated. I often make the distinction when people talk about, you're a Swedenborgian scholar. No, I'm not a scholar of Swedenborg. I'm a scholar of the reception of Swedenborg, of how he is interpreted and how he comes. And the answer to that is varied and overwhelming. As far as when we talk about esoteric authors, so authors we would clearly talk about being esoteric, Swedenborg was at the center of 19th century cultural life. At the very, very center. He lives a long life, 1688 to 1772, almost 100 years. So he lives very late into the 18th century. His ideas really start being picked up in the late, you could make various arguments. I'm going to say from 1790, they're very clearly established amongst reading networks of people who are very taken with his philosophy. They don't often, this is sort of a point that I brought up before, and also it's a point that the two people who wrote Initiating the Millennium, I think that's what it's called, when they're talking about the Avignon Society, whose names, again, I probably should have looked up ahead of time, but I can't remember right off. But they talked about, in the early days of the Swedenborgian movement, before it was very clearly established as a distinct theological doctrine, he was often set in conversation with several other spiritual writings. For instance, the teachings of Johannes Southcott, Richard Brothers, various Quaker preachers, and also Jakob Böhme. People who are sort of a general spiritual writers of the late 18th century. In the early 19th century, you start finding people talking about these senses of self and direction, and one of the most bizarre, and it truly is a sort of a strange teaching, was this teaching about Swedenborgian Buddhism. And it's very interested also in this notion of free will. And it's based around the teachings of essentially one man. And he converted to Swedenborgianism, and then he became he produced the first Buddhist magazine in America, Carl Hermann Vetterling, who called himself Vilangi Dasa, and he was fascinated by these notions about what he called was the Buddhism in Swedenborg, so the absence of self, this sort of self-delusory, and that's one particular reason, one particular reading of Swedenborg that was quite radical. Blake probably is a little more reactionary against this sort of thing, and he often referred to what he called was the higher Buddhism in Swedenborg. And it's and I've never actually read the book. I tried one time, and it's a conversation between all these different. I think one of them is a Hawaiian, and one of them's a Parsi, and they're just talking about religion. And it's designed to convey how Swedenborgianism is secretly this higher directive of Buddhism, and there's a lot of interesting connection between how Buddhist concepts. We were talking about free will and everything. That's what made me think about it, and how people found connections. D.T. Suzuki, the Zen teacher, was very taken by Swedenborg. He wrote the first book in Japanese, but actually before him there were several prominent followers of Swedenborg in Japan, but this was in the beginning of the 20th century. Several of them were related to a man named Thomas Lake Harris, who founded a movement in Santa Rosa, California. And after he died, they took his sort of interpretation of Buddhism back to Japan, and to my knowledge, it's very small, but I think it's still going. So there you go. But when we ask us questions about how is Swedenborg's teachings received more generally, one, they're everywhere. Everyone read them. There were references to the 1840s in America as being the Buddhist century. Everyone is influenced by them. From literally, we could sit here and talk about most of the major players in literature. They have strong Swedenborgian connections, or have read Swedenborg for several years. And this goes well into approaching the post-war period. For instance, Jung read Swedenborg. Anyone who you can think of, the Transcendentalists in America read Swedenborg. And they were all, it was this fascinating idea about how do you connect? How do you connect the sort of everyday, boring world with spiritual significance? And that's sort of Swedenborg. Swedenborg does this in a very sort of dry way. We probably should at some point talk about his writing style, which is
not the easiest to read.
No, definitely not. He was not someone who I feel like most people would really enjoy reading. It's a very dry, very descriptive, but it's not descriptive like a novelist. It's descriptive like a scientist And that for Borges, for instance, was very appealing. As Borges said, unlike these sort of wishy-washy mystics, I mean, Swedenborg's really laying it down for you. He's someone who's like, not only am I going to tell you of heaven, I'm going to tell you what it's made out. Very appealing.
Yeah. One other thing, as an aside, I was talking with Luke Walker a few months ago about his interest in Allen Ginsberg and William Blake. And Swedenborg did come up in the conversation there, although there wasn't a lot of in-depth discussion with regard to Swedenborg. I was wondering, do you know anything more about this connection between Ginsberg and Swedenborg?
Well, to my knowledge, and I very well may be wrong, I don't know so much about Ginsberg, if I'm honest. Ginsberg, I think most of what he takes from Swedenborg comes through Blake.
Right, okay.
And Blake also has a very unique read. Blake is the classic autodidact who is not always so clear in his interpretation. And yeah, the only thing that I can say about that is that I don't know if you talked about his recordings, but Ginsberg did a series of Ginsberg did a series of recordings because he felt like Blake commanded him to set his writings down. And Blake was the major influence of major influence on Ginsberg throughout most of his early poetry. And in fact, I think the first ever mystical experience, he has the experience of a sunflower not too long after he's released from a mental hospital. And he had that notion, and it's sort of the blossoming of his spiritual engagement. But one thing that my own research really tries to highlight is that Swedenborg has been perceived many, many times by literary historians. But I feel like it's often not seen as clear when we start talking about Swedenborg's application in the political sphere. And what my own current work is, in looking in the 19th century movements of the Theosophical Society, not the one that was founded by H.P. Blavatsky in the 1870s, but the Theosophical Society that was founded, in the late 18th century, specifically to circulate Swedenborg's writings and discuss it. This became the grounds for a real engagement, especially through the work of Charles Augustus Tulk, where people are trying to apply Swedenborgian ideas into real-world problems. And it was not exclusively an English phenomenon. That literally you can trace elements of Swedenborgian ideology from notions of public planning, cooperative societies, early versions of socialism, labor movements. Many people are drawing Swedenborg in interesting and novel ways. And it's not solely to say that there are levels of experience, but it's actually this notion that we can remake the world in a divine image. And it was a very, very powerful view. And especially, we don't even have to, again, we can talk about the Swedenborgian influence in the Second French Empire, to notions of state and emperor and how things are regulated. You can also talk about Swedenborgianism in the Australian context with Alfred Deakin and this idea of, I don't feel like it's an overstatement to say that for Alfred Deakin, the whole goal of Australian the federations of Australia, that was for him a Swedenborgian. And he often connected his political work directly in with how he understood Swedenborg's ideas. And it's a very important point, I feel like. It's been almost completely left out.
This is very interesting that this political side, I guess, of the conversation as with regard to Swedenborg and his teachings, his ideas, his notions about is this then creating the heaven here? Is that what this is about?
I think so. or it's not necessarily creating a heaven here. Although, yeah, I think that you can talk about the Swedenborgian reception amongst, like, the French utopian socialists, for instance. Saint-Simon Fourier, I think that there was significant influence from Swedenborg's ideas. But it's more so, like, if you have access to the highest manifestations of reality as it should be, the heavenly realms, this was an argument that was made by Tulk, then you're sort of dumb not to want to apply that in ways that you can do so. And that notion, well, it seems very strange to us because we're not often used to talking about Western political notions as being strongly influenced by religious ideologies, particularly esoteric ones. But that was a huge impetus. And how do we change the world for the better? Lots of people, when they were asking that question, said we can learn from heaven as it's been depicted. And, my work basically follows people who really took that to task. How do we remake heaven on earth based on Swedenborgian ideas? And Tulk, which we'll talk, a little bit later, Tulk is a particular, he's very interested in translating the Bible. So, for instance, while there's a split in the Swedenborgian Society, where basically part of the members become a church, sort of like a respectable religious body that does baptisms and confirmations and weddings. And to be honest, that's where most Swedenborgian interest comes today, from followers of the tradition as a religious tradition. But Tulk's particular idea was that that Swedenborg's idea should be much broader. So he founds the Theosophical Society. Eventually, this is going to be a forerunner of what we talk about as the Swedenborg Societies today. I think that it would not be that there is some connection between this early idea, and it's the idea that if you gave his writings, they would find a wide appeal. And he's done tremendous things. For instance, he was very involved in numerous different societal improvement campaigns, all based very strongly on his particular reading of Swedenborg. And the one point is particularly about founding a church. Tulk was never interested in founding a church because he said, if you go throughout Swedenborg's writings, he goes to many places in the spiritual world. He goes to what we would consider to be mines and these different places. But he never visits a church, Tulk says. So the application for Swedenborg's ideas cannot be in the foundation of another religious sect. And it was, very, very popular. And followers of this particular ideology were throughout the sort of reforming world of 19th century London. By focusing on this history, we're getting a complete retelling of the value systems that drove a lot of the most prominent changes in British society in the 19th century. From women's rights down to asylum reform, it was just a continuous push for these sorts of things. And their engagement, every day I'm discovering about a Tulk associate or someone who's involved in the Theosophical Society. They were involved in another project, spearheaded another coalition or another action. And it's just, it never ends. It's so fascinating.
It is fascinating. Just to clarify, though, when you're speaking of the Theosophical Society, are you talking about the society after the schism?
So no.
No?
Actually, the Theosophical Society is a little bit before the schism. And this is basically concerning Robert Hindmarsh, for instance, is arguably the founder of the Swedenborgian Church. And he holds a conference. And the idea was that the actual doctrines would be preserved in a church structure, whereas before they'd been the product of a sort of informal reading society. But after, this idea that there should be a church formation that would basically follow in lines of another Protestant sect, this was specifically what Tulk sort of rejected. and his father and their sort of compatriots did not view this church idea. And in fact, when you look at early Swedenborgian readers, you find, I mean, there were Quaker readers, there were Anglican readers, Baptists. I mean, it was very broad. And they wanted to sort of preserve this idea that to read and to be engaged in Swedenborg is not to join a church, but rather to understand the world more clearly.
Okay, so what Tulk was doing, and those who were associated with Tulk and doing, involved in those activities, they were not then associated with what is now known as the New Church or Swedenborgianism.
No, they were not associated with the New Church or the Swedenborgian Church. No.
Okay.
They very often they kept their family's religious devotion. So,
right. Okay. And what Tulk was doing was more within the kind of the organization of the Theosophical Society then, before the schism?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, again, when we talk about these sorts of terms, I mean, you have this idea of a society, this very clear, organized thing. It really isn't.
Yeah.
It's much more. I mean, how I've sort of talked about it was, I mean, people have recognized the significance of Swedenborgianism and social reform movements for a very long time. But one of the sort of issues comes about how do we discuss these things? Because in a lot of ways, they are not so clearly defined. Membership, for instance, isn't clearly defined. And the way that I've had to sort of go about doing that is to rely on networks, connections. Mm-hmm. Basically, how are you talking about Swedenborg and how is that different than what they're talking about in the church system?
Right.
And that's sort of been the goal. But yeah, I mean, you have to do a lot of groundwork because the language that we have today about speaking about movements of reform in cultural history, esotericism studies, etc., they're not so clearly prepared to do these kinds of.
I can see why.
Sort of broad.
Yeah, right. So could you talk a little bit more about Tulk then? And was Tulk active in England at this time?
Yes.
Okay.
So Charles Augustus Tulk was born in 1786. He dies in 1849. And he would eventually become a member of Parliament. For Sudbury, he was, as I've said, he was one of the most engaged radical reformers in the 19th century, or at least the early part of the 19th century. And he was one of the most central figures in trying to apply Swedenborgian's ideas to society in large. And what we talk about the Theosophical Society, this is also connected to basically a meeting that took place in this Hoxton. It's called the Hoxton meetings. And this was in this town in Shropshire. And this was sort of where, this was the intellectual vanguard. So people attended these places to hear about the various positions that Swedenborg had and his intellectual capacities. And it had a fascinating atmosphere because people would come together and they would just say, it was a very, they were interested in forward thinking and it was a very speculative society. But they produced a lot of actual political outgrowths from this and were instrumental in a lot of major decision makings, especially for driving liberal policy in Britain. So very interesting stuff.
It is very interesting. Well, as we are experiencing a little bit of a technical difficulty here with the sound, I think maybe this would be a good point for us to wrap up the interview. I want to thank you, Dell, for sharing all of this with me today. I learned a lot of new stuff, and I feel like we only scratched the surface, actually, of this whole topic. So if you are interested and willing, I would love to have you back at a future date so that we can talk more about this, and hopefully our internet connection will be a little bit more kind to us. We won't have the issues that we were having earlier. But if you're up for it, I would love to have you back.
It would be a pleasure.
Wonderful.
It really would. And hopefully I won't ramble so much and we'll get more of the details.
I love the rambling. That's the best part.
God bless you. I will say again, God bless you. Because, we have this position right now in academia where it's like people want something like they want absolute coherence. And I think to myself, it takes me. I'm not coherent in the best of days. You have to work with me.
I'm happy to work with you, Dell. No issues whatsoever on my part. I love the rambling, and I have a tendency to do that myself. So maybe that's why I like talking to you.
Exactly. Let's just ramble together. Who knows where we're going to go? We're following like Tulk in the Theosophical Society.
That's right.
We're open to free interpretation.
Exactly. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today, Dell, and I wish you all the best with your research. And I am looking forward to our future date where we can discuss Swedenborg in a little bit more detail.
That's right. Let's talk about old Swede.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dell.
You're very welcome.
My thanks again to Dell for a lovely discussion and for his interesting insights. Unfortunately, the technical issues cut this interview short, but I am very much looking forward to another discussion with Dell in the future. If you, dear listener, have any particular questions that you'd like to ask Dell for that future discussion, please email me at stephanie@rejectedreligion.com. A little announcement. The SWAY 9 conference in Sweden is coming up very soon, so I will be taking a break in the month of June to work on my research and presentation for that event. Additionally, there are many huge personal projects on the agenda for the summer that will prevent me from uploading in July and August as well, but I plan to be back by September with new podcast episodes and spotlights. I will try to keep in touch via social media and my blog in this time period, so I appreciate everyone's patience in this very busy upcoming period. As always, thanks for listening.